All right, hey everybody, Miss Lynch here. This is part 2 of chapter 21's lecture, okay? Let me get situated real quick. Okay, last time we were talking about FDR's first couple of years in office and the first New Deal. So really 1933 to 1936-ish, okay? And like I said, that I was gonna end with the first New Deal and we're gonna start this with the second New Deal. So that's where I'm at. Okay, actually I need to make a note real quick to myself before I forget. Okay, you should have everything in front of you and you should be ready to go. Okie dokie, the second New Deal. Spurred by the failure of his initial policies, which, thinking back to what I had said in the first half, I was like, there are, these organizations and these things being created that will kind of, pretty much the first New Deal walked so that the second New Deal could run, okay? But so what didn't work out with the first one inspires the changes of the second one, which is good. It shows our administration is able to learn and adapt based on popular sentiment, okay? Okay. So yeah, we're still focusing pretty heavily on greater economic equality. And okay, so 1935 is the beginning of our second New Deal, and this time around there is a greater emphasis on economic security, okay? During the first little bit of the second New Deal, one of the first things they do is the electrification of a lot of rural areas. So the REA, the Rural Electrification Agency, like I said, they provided electricity in our rural areas. I know that in my family, my great-grandparents, is that right? Great-great-grandparents? But they got electricity during this era. So I remember hearing it was during the Depression, so I'm guessing it was probably as part of our electrification process. Okay, but so the federal government also tried to promote soil conservation. I had on this before. Think about everything that was going on with the Dust Bowl. That was because of poor farming practices and severe drought kind of culminating. But in order to prevent future dust bowls, scientists start really looking at soil conservation during this point in time, okay? Yeah, and then also the idea of family farming and not our huge, well, going back to our bonanza farms, but our large corporate farmers, trying to kind of steer away from that and focus on the smaller enterprises, okay? Okay, last time I was like, well, we'll talk about the WPA, which is what I'm about to talk about. But I said before that, the precursor to the WPA was the PWA, okay? So that was the Public Works Administration. So now there's a shifting focus beginning in 1934 to the WPA, which is our Works Progress Administration, okay? Again, still focusing on the same stuff. So building those roads and bridges and dams and public buildings, okay? All of that construction still remains during the second New Deal, and will really continue until the US enters World War II. And there are, resources online. You can just look up buildings in Oklahoma from the WPA era, and I have a guide, not with me, but I have a guide that goes through, county by county, everything that was built. So you can track everything down. Here in Edmond, the armory that's right down the street from UCO, I think that was a WPA project. A lot of armories were. So anyway, but you can do that on your own time. Okay, like I said, this will go until World War II, but so this helps a lot of people gain employment, all right? the first stage of things during the first New Deal, I'd said that 3 million people would pass through the Conservation Corps. So the WPA, our second phase, another 3 million people will go through and get employment during the 30s. Okay, like I said, our public works, so road construction, all of that jazz. But so thousands of public buildings and bridges were constructed, over 500,000 miles of roads, so almost 500,000 miles, and 600 airports were constructed. So our airline industry really is beginning to thrive during the 30s. That will pause during the war, and then in the 50s, it will really take off and become kind of what we know today, okay? But airport construction, also things like stadiums, pools, sewage treatment plants, okay, so public works. And actually here on UCO's campus, they're in Mitchell Hall, if you've ever been there, that's the theater on the west end of campus. But along the back wall, there used to be a mural it was done by AC Blue Eagle, say a Caddo artist, and it was painted over, but it's still under these layers of paint. But I do believe, I don't have it in the copy that I'm looking at, but I think that there should be a couple of pieces of his art in the PowerPoint that I've sent to you guys. Woody Carmbo was another first American artist who kind of rose to popularity during the 1930s. But yeah, so those are just a couple of examples, okay? Okay, so let's talk about Social Security for just a second. So the centerpiece of the second New Deal was the Social Security Act of 1935, and this was a system of unemployment insurance and old age pensions, which is, what we know it as today. And it was also an aid for the disabled and poor, okay? It represented a dramatic departure from the traditional functions of government, which I had hit on before because I was saying that, the government was considered super progressive during this time and was willing to work with the general public and people who were organizing and speaking out and saying that they need help. So Social Security was a very progressive act, okay? Yeah, a dramatic departure. Okay, so I'm looking at A Reckoning with Liberty, okay? So Roosevelt was a master of political communication and used his fireside chats to great effect. So his fireside chats were this series of TED Talks, basically, that FDR put out, and we've talked about radios are entering the public home in mass numbers. So this was huge. People were hearing for the first time, president speaking, they're hearing him speak in their homes. So it's kind of this profound moment in time where, it was just this new thing for the American public. So the power of, FDR harnessed the power of radio in a way to to reach citizens. And so by the mid-1930s, half of all homes had radios. It's something small. Well, you could get smaller ones. I should say they were overall pretty large contraptions, but you could get smaller ones. You could get cheap ones. So this was something that was accessible to people. So half of all homes have radios by the mid-30s. And in the election of 1936, FDR wins in a landslide, okay? By a landslide, I should say. Okay. Alrighty, he wins re-election. So this takes us we're now in 1937. And the momentum of the second New Deal is kind of slowing. All right, it's kind of become established in what it can do. So it's out, people are out of the honeymoon phase in regards to the Second New Deal. Okay, in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Bill passed, and this banned goods that were produced by child labor. So, you know, we've talked about our workers in the Progressive Era organizing for child labor, against it, and for children's rights, okay? So this is a huge movement in that wave of our workers' movement that comes back in the 30s, okay? So this banned goods produced by child labor from internet commerce. There's also a minimum wage that's finally set, and overtime is, oh, my stomach's growing like crazy. And overtime is established as a policy. So the policy of overtime pay, okay, there. Okay. Alrighty, so like I said, 1937, this witnessed a sharp downturn of the economy. Federal funding for the WPA and other projects was cut, and the unemployment rate rose. So like I said, the honeymoon phase had worn off. People thought that what could be done by this policy had been done, and so people start they loosen up. And yeah, funding is cut, and then, you know, unemployment starts to spike. So, okie dokie. The limits of change. All right. The New Deal brought more women into government involvement than ever before, but organized feminism, which was already in disarray during the 20s. So thinking back, women get the vote, and then in the 1920s, there's kind of this attitude of complacency of, well, you got the vote, what else do you want? Okay, so feminism, yeah, as an organized movement, starts to kind of decline. We'll get back to it down the road some more, but 1920s, 1930s, it kind of disappears, yeah, as a political force. Okay. During the Depression, women were discouraged, from working in order to make room for unemployed men. You know, our breadwinners of the family unit. So yeah, women were really encouraged to stay home, try to manage any semblance of that family unit that might be still in existence, and create room in the workforce for their husbands, okay, for men. Okay, so the Economy Act of 1933 prohibited couples from holding government jobs together. So that just kind of reiterates this room that was being made. So it was illegal for a couple to have two members both working for the U.S. government, okay? Employers such as banks and schools barred married women from jobs. And the issue with that is that, so Social Security was then skewed because this left women uncovered because they couldn't work out of the home, okay? So it creates this disproportionate view of numbers, and also, you know, left women incredibly, I keep using the word vulnerable today, but again, left women vulnerable, okay? Okie dokie. I removed this from my written notes, but I have it in here. But the Southern veto. So the power of the South helped to mold the New Deal welfare state into an entitlement for Caucasian Americans. So this, looking at the slide right before this, so this insistence to have these jobs open for particular demographics. So previously talking about men, now we can say that this was done for Caucasian Americans. Yeah, okay, so going off of that, this creates this entitlement for Caucasian Americans. Social Security law excluded agricultural and domestic workers. Okay, so this is the largest category of African American employment, regardless of gender. All right. And so in the South, our African American communities were confined to state-determined standards of benefits, which were usually low, created a system of dependency, which was already in place, because of our sharecropping system that has been around for generations in the South at this point. So this just reinforces this system of poverty, all right, for a new generation. And this will go really until we get up into the 1990s. So the welfare system ended in 1996. African American organizations lobbied for changes in Social Security with groups like the NAACP and the Urban League. All right, so the injustices within the system were recognized for a very long time and spoken out against. Okay, so this is what, and I should have this in quotations, this is the quote, Indian New Deal, end quote, okay? All right, so the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Collier, launched what is known as the quote-unquote Indian New Deal. The actual title of it is the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, and it marks the most radical shift in Indigenous American policy in our nation's history. This ended the policy of forced assimilation, going back to the Dawes Act, so forced assimilation and the boarding school system. And this allowed for cultural autonomy and increased spending on healthcare, but it leaves the reservation system primarily intact, the way it had stood going back to the Dawes Act and the 1880s and all of that, okay? So, moves in the right direction, okay? But still flawed. We will talk about that more whenever we get into, our next chapter, World War II, a little bit, and we will see where our reservations stand when we talk about Japanese internment camps, okay? Alrighty, so for Mexican Americans, the Depression was a terrible experience. Again, they were excluded from the Social Security Act because it did not apply to agricultural workers or domestic workers, all right? And during this time, and we've talked about this at a couple of points, so many workers are going to California, going north to California, going west to California, but it then creates this bubble where the job market is not there the way everyone who's going there has been told that, yes, there is employment there for you. There are bonanza farms, there are thousands of acres, okay? But that system implodes on itself during this time, okay? So, 400,000 workers would return to Mexico during the 1930s, and this was mostly from California, like I said, okay? Okay. So the last slide I have on here is our last hired, first fired. So let us talk about African American workers during the Depression, okay? So our African American community was the hardest hit by the Depression. And if you look at unemployment rates regarding African American workers, they are on average double of Caucasian American workers. Think about Chicago. I had said that during the Depression, Chicago's unemployment rate, it hits 50% at one point. All right. There is a significantly large African American community there coming out of the great migration from the South that we had discussed before. Okay, so these unemployment rates are, yeah, literally doubled from other communities. Okay, the federal housing policy revealed limits of New Deal freedom. Federal employment practices also discriminated on the basis of race. And it's not until the 1960s, like I said, this will be another generation, but in the 1960s, those who were left out of New Deal programs will win inclusion in the American welfare state. And the New Deal improved economic conditions, but it's World War II that ends the Great Depression. It's not like it was resolved. There are just larger matters at hand that then have to be addressed. So we will get into that next time. But, that is the Depression and FDR's presidency in a nutshell. So anyway, okay, if you guys have any questions, please let me know. Shoot me an email, and I'll talk to you later. Okay, bye.